phase?
To discuss, I'm going to ignore this because I got to be within 2 inches to get any traction there. To talk about the history of the TESL Reporter, I have to go back and start in the year 1920, when David O. McKay, as a young apostle, was given the assignment to visit every mission in the world. It took him nearly a year, along with his companion, P.J. Cannon. Now, before he became an apostle, you have to remember that he was, for some years, a beloved teacher and school administrator. And this lens affected him as he toured around the world. He came back with 2 conclusions. The members of our church need greater opportunities for education and need better facilities to meet in. 30 years later, when he became president and prophet of the church, he started a very aggressive campaign to build schools and build chapels around the world. In cooperation with that effort was the creation of the Labor Missionary Program. And this institution and PCC are among the many that are owing their existence, if you will, to this program and that profit. You'll see how this ties in a second. So we often talk about Alice Pack as the mother and co-founder of the TESL major on this campus, and we sometimes talk about Bill Conway, who is the other co-founder and, if you will, father of the TESL program. But one person that we don't talk about very much is Ish Dagner, who I consider the godfather of the EIL and TESL programs, and thus indirectly the TESL Reporter. To summarize briefly, Ish, a local boy, former Kamehameha School senior class president, was the very first blue chip student that the registrar's office was able to find and bring to this campus. It was a great PR victory for the university in its early ages. He came in 57, I believe, and graduated in 1961. And with his new degree in English, he went to one of David O. McKay's new schools in the Pacific, Mount Usama High School in American Samoa. There's a picture of the front of the school. It still looks the same today. The church sold it at one point to the government. It is now the American Samoa Community College. He was assigned to 9th grade, and as he began to teach, he realized there was a huge chasm between the curriculum and the textbooks and where the students were. He did a little language testing and found that the students ranged anywhere from 9th grade all the way down to 3rd grade in their reading and writing abilities in English, which of course was not their first language. So the facilities were excellent, but the U.S. curriculum and textbooks, which had been sent from the mainland, along with all of the imported teachers brought in from the mainland, generally were not suited to the needs of the learners. He shared his feelings in a letter to the chair of the LDS Pacific Board of Education, Dr. Owen Cook, who would later become one of the presidents of this university. In that letter, he stated, "We're just not prepared for the educational challenges of teaching these people, especially teaching them in English." Now, at the same time, the head of the Labor Missionary or Building Committee of the church, Wendell Mendenhall, started going around the Pacific and visiting these campuses that he had recently overseen the building of. And when he saw Ish in Samoa, who he had already known before, he says, "Ish, tell me what's going on over here. Bring me up to speed, and don't give me any of that fluff that everyone else has given me." Mendenhall was like that. He was a very blunt and direct man. Stagner said, well, actually, you're building wonderful buildings, and the labor missionary program is absolutely inspired, but we just have insurmountable teaching challenges here. At the end of the school year, contract was up. Stagner left and went to Provo to work on his master's degree. One day, President Mendenhall called him on the phone and said, do you have time to come up and talk with President McKay? But you'll only have 5 minutes, and his secretary will be timing you, so that's all you have. If you've read anything about Claire Middlemiss, his secretary, she was an amazing woman who controlled every aspect of McKay's office, schedule, etc. So he says, okay. At the meeting, President McKay said, Brother Stagner, who President McKay also already knew from the dedication of these buildings in 1958. I understand that we're not doing what we should in the Pacific for our saints there. And Stagner replied that everybody was trying, but nobody knew what to do or how to do it, how to teach in a foreign language context. President McKay said, well, what do you recommend? And Stagner said, well, I recommend that we use a different approach called teaching English as a second language. It's a brand new field. The other thing that I recommend is that we take all of our international students at CCH and put them through an English as a second language program to ramp up their English abilities so that they can pass freshman English and move on towards their bachelor's degree. And I recommend that a portion of them be taken through a new major called teaching English as a second language, and that they then be sent back home in order to teach appropriately. President McKay looked at him and said, that's exactly what the church needs, Brother Stagner. And at this point, his 5 minutes were up. He got the signal. President McKay said, thank you, Brother Stagner. That's enough. Goodbye. Stagner returned to CCH, and as a result of that meeting in Salt Lake, he immediately began what we call today the EIL program in 1963, and later helped to establish the TESL major in 1967. Stagner immediately asked Bill Conway, who had replaced him at Mapusanga High School, to come up to CCH and help him get started with a new major. Well, they started visiting schools in the mainland and attending relevant conferences together. And there were a number, anywhere from 12 to 20 new master's degree programs in teaching English as a second language, springing up here and there, but nobody was doing anything at the undergraduate level. Well, in Stagner's own words, quote, shortly before I left CCH to work on a PhD, I had a good friend by the name of Alice Pack, who was also interested in what we were doing. I received a letter at about the same time from Dr. Gerald Dykstra saying that he was coming from California to the University of Hawaii to help its brand new MA program in teaching English as a second language, and wondered if we had anybody on our campus that might be interested in this new MA program. Well, Stagner's response was, I've got this lady over here. She's going to be your best student. Alice Pack. Well, Alice and Bill both signed up for this MA program. They would teach their full load of courses on this campus in the morning, and then they would race to Honolulu to take a full course of graduate classes there. Alice wrote in her biography that there were times when she felt like quitting. You have to remember she's already over 55, and she's handling 2 full-time responsibilities. But in the end, she said she was grateful that she persisted, survived, and obtained her master's degree. Well, anyway, while driving one day to classes, the 2 of them were talking about an idea to create a quarterly publication that would serve, first of all, as a PR vehicle to let the world know about our new major on this campus. And they would also share practical ideas, lesson plans, techniques, methods, new materials, etc., as a service to the institutions in Pacific Basin. So in the beginning, the mission was for the church schools in the CES, South Pacific area, as well as other schools, University of Guam, etc., etc., etc. Well, the journal then was off to a good start. The university administration liked the two-pronged mission, and they funded whatever it was going to take for printing and mailing and so forth. In the beginning, and for some years actually, the TESL Reporter looked exactly like its title. It was a kind of newsletter-ish format. It was newsy, particularly about this campus. And as you can see here, an article about the Reporter itself, the fact that CCH just got a new language lab and the new degree, and so on and so forth. Well, in sum, things were going well, and here I'm going to introduce a metaphor that I'll pursue throughout the remainder of my remarks today. It's based on a very famous, well-loved children's book, The Little House. News of the TESL major was not only spread internationally, or at least regionally, by the TESL Reporter, but more amazingly, by an article which Bill Conway got published in the third volume of TESL Quarterly, which was the flagship journal of our new profession. And that journal basically told the world about our lovely new major. This is just a screenshot there. This is a table of contents. If you look at the names, these are all massive names in our field. And here in the midst of them is Bill Conway, a very young, just out of graduate school person, writing about our major to the world. Now let me talk a little bit more about the mission, scope, and circulation of the TESL Reporter. Originally, the audience, as I said, was for the Pacific, and it was for the purpose of telling the world about our campus and our program. Here's an article from 1972, 3 issues. We see some of the graduates early on in the program. There was even an article about how we changed our name in 1974 from Church College of Hawaii to what we have now. Here's a great picture of when our EIL program carried out a self-study. And by the way, our EIL program was one of the first few programs in the country to adopt TESL's new self-study standards and apply them. We got a lot of good publicity out of that, and conference presentations and publications. A nice group picture here. I think Perry was about 17 when this picture was taken.
You're not even in there, Mark.
We made our graduates world famous before they walked out the door. Here's an article summarizing some years of our seniors and the research projects that they did. And believe it or not, we had readers write in asking for copies of some of these senior papers, and I've highlighted Brent Green's here from 1990. It's hard to believe he's that old. There's just no gray hair under that red. Well, to pick up the narrative here again, Bill Conway leaves after 2 years to pursue a PhD in technical writing and never returns to ESL or BYU-Hawaii. He ends up spending basically his entire career at BYU-Idaho and became a nationally recognized expert in technical writing. But I have one last farewell shot here of Bill Conway in class with 4 of our first 6 students. Each one of these went on to amazing careers, each very different from the other. The only people who are not in this picture are Leola's mother, who probably graduated the semester before, and Noel McGreevy from New Zealand. By the way, after 12 highly productive years, Alice Pack decides to retire as well. And she is replaced by, as you can see, assistant editor Lynn Henriksen. Lynn Henriksen takes over. We'll say goodbye to Alice here. And by the way, Lynn Hansen, who's with us today, thank you, came in 1980 as Alice Pack's position replacement. Am I correct there?
78.
78, thank you. So, you must have replaced Ron Shook then, perhaps? You know?
I thought it was Alice Pack.
Alice Pack? I believe she retired just a pinch after. Did you meet on campus?
Beg your pardon?
Did you meet on campus, you and Alice?
No, I met her at a conference in Mexico.
Okay, so maybe she left a little earlier than 1980. Thank you. So Lynn Henriksen takes over and becomes, for many years, the TESL Reporter editor at that point. And over the 12 or 15 years that he edited the journal, he revised the format, he indexed all that, or I should say he got language and language behavior abstracts, which was an internationally based reference entity to include all back issues. He got the ERIC document database to include all back issues. He hired but he obtained an editorial advisory board and ultimately converted from a paper-based to a computer-based page layout system and increased circulation of the TESL Reporter from hundreds to thousands. At its height, we probably had about 3,000 subscriptions in 60 countries. And who knows how many readers, because many of those subscriptions were English department addresses. And like we do in our department now, we simply clip a circulation slip to the periodical and it roams around our office. Well, when Henriksen decided to take a position at the linguistics department in Provo, then assistant editor Mark James took over on the eve of the Silver Jubilee 25th anniversary issue. Although subscription did not substantially increase over the years that I edited the journal, we did widen subscriptions or subscribership to over 110 countries. Let me give you a little bit of a context for the birth of the TESL Reporter. The field or profession of teaching English as a second language was brand new professionally in 1967, although of course people have been teaching English for 1,000 years. And there were several journals as well, and 2 professional organizations. The 2 professional organizations both were born in 1967, TESL, which was American-based, and TEFL, British-based. The oldest journal directly relevant to our field was the ELT journal, which started in 1946, the English Teaching Forum in 1962, which was coordinated by the USIS office attached to embassies around the world. And 3 journals in 1967, Foreign Language Annals, TESL Quarterly, and the TESL Reporter. So 1967 was really a banner year for our field. As the field matured and grew more complicated, obviously journals began to multiply and become more specialized. And so taking the metaphor just a little bit here, we can see the neighborhood growing a bit crowded. generalist journals like ours and foreign language annals had to compete with more and more specialized journals. Journal, for example, of second language writing, and if that wasn't specific enough, Journal of Response to Writing. Okay, that's an inside joke. In addition, local and regional organizations began their own publications. So Thai TESL Journal, RALC Journal out of Singapore, JALT Journal out of Japan, and so forth. And so the field, again, looked even more complicated. Now let me talk about the work. Edit, decide, communicate, but the most fun was always communicating. And partly because in the old days, you got letters, not email, or tweets. And so if you were a stamp collector, well, great. You could get stamps from all over the world as these things came in asking for one thing or another, or submitting manuscripts. And these are just a few examples. The letters inside those envelopes, I'll share just a few. Here's one from Leohana High School in Tonga. Dear Sir, Madam, I have just been informed by Brent Green, our local director of the Tonga English Language Institute, that English teachers here in Tonga can get free subscriptions to the TESL Reporter. I'm therefore writing to ask if you would kindly consider blah, blah, blah. Yours truly, Mele Tamoakeao, who was then vice president and one of the greatest school administrators our church has seen in this region. Here's another letter. Dear TESL Reporter staff, I see that you are now changing your policy and are asking for $6 subscriptions for US subscribers and remaining free internationally. Well, I'd feel guilty receiving it here in Japan, so here's a check for $50. Keep up the good work. Yours sincerely, Thomas Raw. Now, those of you who know Thomas Raw, talking about extensive reading, it's one of the great figures in my figure, and obviously a very kind one. Here's a letter from Germany. Dear Dr. James, for years now, I've received the TESL Reporter. There are many journals which I must read, and which I always tell myself I must. Yet the TESL Reporter is the only one that I actually do read immediately, cover to cover. Best regards, so on and so forth. And here's my most favorite. I love getting letters from the Middle East because culturally they write with very flowery and respectful language. And so here we go. Dear sir, first of all, thank you for the opportunity that this gives me to address your staff through this letter. I have recently known your address, and without hesitation, I decided to write to your majesty. I read this every morning. So that's the fun side. The not so fun side was, for many of the early years, the editor not only did all of that stuff, but did all the page layout as well. You were a one-person band. And so in those early days, before computers were invented, we had what was called a typositor. A typositor was kind of like this big, bulky typewriter-looking machine. You typed the text in twice, and I don't know why twice, but you had to type it in completely twice and hopefully do it exactly the same both times, and then you press the button and it would print out what you had typed in a justified column to your specifications, however wide you wanted that. You printed the titles and page numbers, etc. Separately. And then you trimmed them. You can see it one sitting beside the typositor there. And then you took it through a hot wax machine. And then you laid it on a gridded kind of paper which sat on a backlight table. And so the grid is on the back of the paper, but it shines through enough for you to be able to place it perfectly horizontally and, vertically and horizontally. And then you use X-Acto knives if necessary to cut out typos and paste in a misspelled word, a little page number at the bottom. Sometimes you had to do it several times over because you never quite got it exactly correctly. It was a ton of work. Well, in the mid-'80s, of course, the Macintosh computer came out, and soon thereafter, laser printers. And this just really changed the world of the editor, because now you could type in, print out, justify text. Now you still had to paste it onto the 2-page galley sheets and get it, horizontally and vertically correct. But the work of X-Acto knives and scissors and hot wax were a thing of the past. When the galley sheets were finally ready, we would drive them into Honolulu to be printed. Finally, BYU-Hawaii Print Services got new equipment, and we were able to do it here locally. But Michelle Campbell and Tanya Smith both have had to learn multiple desktop software, beginning with the very earliest one called Ready, Set, Go. I don't think anybody here is old enough to remember that. Anyway, this made digital images ultimately easy to send off to authors for a final proof, to get back fairly quickly, not have to rely on the mail services to do that, and generate a final proof for the editor. Life for editors was now a breeze, although it became more difficult for the department secretaries. In the final years, BYU-Hawaii Print Services took over most of the formatting as well, and so Tanya was able to just send over Word documents, and Craig Nakayama would do all of the desktop formatting for us. Let me talk a little bit about distribution. In the beginning, there were only a few hundred copies that went out into the Pacific, but at some point we reached thousands and across multiple countries, as I mentioned. And the post office was quite good, partly because there were only 2 mailing rates, US and international. And so you just brought over the 2 batches and they were fine, but the mailing process got really complicated, and there were different rates for different countries and different reliability coefficients across countries, and it was just getting really, really messy, and the prices were exorbitant. Some countries, it cost us $30 to send an issue of the TESL Reporter. That's like 10 times the cost to make that issue. Mailing was becoming a problem. Proselyting, another piece of work for the editor. In the early days, when the journal was brand new, obviously proselyting was absolutely necessary to get the word out. In later years, when the journal was buried amongst hundreds of other journals in our professions, proselyting was absolutely necessary. And so the editor always traveled to conferences with a box of back issues, a heavy shoulder bag every morning from the hotel, distributing sample copies to potential authors, pass-along cards. I think here's an image of a pass-along card that I used to throw out on the tables at the luncheon areas and so on and so forth, trying to maintain our readership as well as to search out potential authors. The enjoyable thing about conferences, though, was commiserating with the other editors. In the beginning, the club was quite small. There were perhaps 12 of us around the table at the International TESL Conference. We'd meet at lunch. We'd talk about our common problems, talk about strategies for dealing with them. And then in the afternoon, in a large ballroom area, we would be in a panel formation on the stage, and we would take questions from the audience. And after that, there was a kind of linger longer session, if you will. where every editor had a little table around the edge of the ballroom, and people could come up and give guidelines for the authors and ask specific questions, so on and so forth. This was all free to all of the journals and under the directorship of the current editor at the time of the TESL Quarterly. Let me talk just a bit about resources. The budget was great in the beginning for materials, printing costs, mailing costs, but when things started to go crazy, it was very difficult to submit a budget for the following year that you had no control over. In one year, paper costs went up 10%. Well, who knew? An example here I've got is in the year 2000, the cost of 2 issues was $10,000. 3 years later, $17,000. That's a huge increase. It's very difficult to budget in advance for a hard copy journal that requires printing and mailing. As far as faculty resources went, well, there was one sacrificial lamb. That lamb got no support. The person who coordinated the EIL program and the TESL program also edited the TESL Reporter with no class release. You see why some of those hot wax columns weren't always located perfectly, because at 11 p.m. your mind is foggy, your vision is blurry, and that's the way it was for a long time until Henderson finally was able to get a one-course release for the year. He set a precedent, which I was later able to build on, and got 2 course releases, one for the fall semester, one for the winter semester. Well, let me talk a little bit about the format. So in the beginning, very newspaperish looking. It changed a little bit over time. These are the different format covers that Henriksen took us through. This is sort of the final cover that we have now. And we went online finally in 2015. This remains our cover. The quote from the annual report when we went online. The Department of English Language Teaching and Learning, which oversees the journal, is excited about the prospects. The ease of online subscription should multiply the influence of the journal and bring many more people to the knowledge of BYU-Hawaii and its mission, unquote. Unfortunately, that never happened. The move to an online presence was far more complex than we had imagined and would take far more resources than we had. One year, we placed an advertisement banner at the top of TESL Journal, which is electronic, just prior to the TESL convention for 2 issues. Thousands of subscribers to that journal, although I don't know what they read or how much they read. But there we were, right at the top with the banner and a hot link right there. You could just click on it and subscribe. We got very few clicks for the thousands of dollars we spent that year. Well, it seemed like, despite our best efforts, it was getting more and more difficult to compete in a world that was becoming increasingly crowded. But I personally was not inclined to read the handwriting on the wall, and so that was left to younger and wiser editors. I want to talk a little bit about authorship. In the beginning years, with so few outlets for publication, we got our fair share of big names, and I'm just throwing a few up here. The ones in bold are TESL presidents. So we looked really great in those early years, but again, the age of specialization and the crowding began to make that less and less possible. But I'll highlight 4 individuals here. Lynn Henriksen came to this university, but before he did, he published his very first article in the TESL Reporter. And and that launched a career which lasted all the way up until a year ago he retired. Keith Foltz published his first article, co-authored with someone else in the TESL Reporter many years ago. As you probably know, Keith has become the most prolific textbook writer in the history of our profession. I mean, we must be nearing like 200 textbooks at this point. Just unbelievable. Every summer, he goes to a little cabin and he writes for the entire summer. So like every summer, he's just generating article after article. And a few years back, I asked him, after his Vocabulary Myths book came out, I said, hey, Keith, would you just write us an article-length kind of summary of the book? We'd love to share this news with many people around the world who aren't receiving all the professional support which would allow them to even see a copy, which he agreed to do. Paul Nation, who back in the day went by ISP Nation, the P standing for Paul, got one of his very earliest manuscripts published in the TESL Reporter. Not on a subject which he became famous for, by the way, because of course vocabulary and reading were his things. Norm Evans got his very first publication in the TESL Reporter. He was just released as the chair of the Department of Linguistics in Provo about a year ago. He's been on sabbatical and has a couple more years, according to him, before he retires. Well, in addition to the number of journals out there, the number of websites that were sharing lesson plans and materials and techniques and ideas and resources were just exploding across the internet in the 1990s. And I just chose this one because this is by one of our finest graduates, Glenn Penrod, ESLGold.com. Well, there we are. The green things, technology, the internet. But I think even more importantly than launching a few people's careers, the one thing that we can be most proud of about the TESL Reporter is that over its lifespan, 50% of the authors were from second and third world contexts. That was the mission, starting with volume 25, to reach out and stay with readers who couldn't otherwise afford the expensive subscription rates or even have reliable internet access. And I'll come back to that. Authorship in recent years, however, has been skewed by increased competitiveness. In countries like China, Iran, Pakistan, and India, the promotion criteria have been ramped up considerably. And so you have desperate people, manuscripts just coming in that are totally inappropriate for the journal. They're not targeted. People don't know how to target articles. On top of that, in a few cases, we had to tell people honestly, look, we are not a ranked journal. We don't have an impact factor because we're not a research journal. And so we're not included in the ranking business. And there are some authors who said right up front in their cover letter, we need to know exactly what your impact factor is. You know, there are algorithms out there that determine impact factor. For example, TESL Reporter Journal has an impact factor of 3.7. The Modern Language Journal is 6 point something. I smiled when I saw that because I've always thought that the Modern Language Journal had become the most influential and important journal in our profession. And it was one of the reasons I retired, because the articles started to become a bit incomprehensible to my mind, and I thought, okay, it's time to walk away. All right, the final thing I want to say is, the early goal, besides being of service, that was an institutional priority. was to be a PR organ for the university, for our program, and for our sponsoring religion. In that sense, we've been, I think, highly successful over the years. For some decades, we were read by many people in countries where the church had not, and in some cases still has not, a lot of work, like the musical performance groups at this campus and BYU-Provo, who have gone out there, put on the best face of our university and the church which sponsors it, and we did the same kind of thing. In response to these efforts to be an ambassador, we get things now and again in return. There's a Muslim missionary university in Iran who every year, or at least twice a year, sends us their latest Islamic literature. Could be biography of some great imam or whatever, in return for our sending the TESL Reporter. Well, let's talk about death. First of all, there were two near-death experiences. The first was at the 25th anniversary. We held a retreat. There's Sister Hanson right there in the middle, just behind Brother Wyman, where we discussed the state of the major. And in the afternoon, we talked about the fate of the TESL Reporter. Was there still a niche? Was there still a mission and a purpose? And out of that retreat, we decided that there was. And so the 25th issue came out. We made it to 50. And then the second near-death experience came when the postal system went nuts. And we asked ourselves again, should we keep on doing this? That's when we made the decision to try to go online, which didn't really work for us, partly because we lost touch with our most loyal readers, which were those who were in the most distant locations and receiving nothing else but the TESL Reporter and had no reliable access to internet, nor could they afford it if it was. Well, it was time then to send the reporter out to pasture. As with any good working horse, you reward it with rest and let it live out the rest of its life. But we in the church know that though the body dies, the spirit lives. Where? Online. Every back issue is there thanks to Justin Marshall and IT Services, who put in tons of work to keyword every article and every issue, and these are now searchable. To briefly conclude, with the TESL Reporter being put at rest, the responsibility for representing this venerable program, this institution and its sponsoring church rests entirely on your shoulders as you teach and travel, present, and publish. And I can only say to each one of you, Godspeed in that place.